Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4 verse 14. There were about 25 million women living in the Persian Empire when Ahasuerus started looking for a new queen. Only 400 young women were chosen. Esther, a young Jewish orphan girl from the city of Susa, was one of them. A year of beautification and adornment led to the final preparation, when a virgin would appear before the emperor, looking as beautiful as possible and, with the help of incense and cosmetic burners, smelling unforgettable. In the end, 12 months of intense preparation came down to one chance to impress the king. For that oh-so-important meeting, each young lady was allowed to adorn herself with whatever clothing or jewelry she wanted. The day after she was introduced to the ruler, she would join the other concubines in another part of the palace, where she would wait indefinitely in the hope that the king would choose her. As in an old Cinderella story, when it was Esther's turn, she stole the king's heart and became his queen. Thus, an obscure Jewish orphan girl was elevated to the highest position of all women in the world at that time. Of all the women in the kingdom, Esther was chosen by the king himself. This was clearly no accident. A power infinitely greater than Ahasuerus was at work, orchestrating his purposes through the emperor's affections. Significantly, Esther kept her Jewish identity secret throughout the process, just as her cousin Mordecai had instructed her to do. This was probably due to the strong anti-Semitism that existed in the Persian Empire at that time. Esther would reveal her ethnic heritage, but only when the situation left her no other choice. In the third chapter of Esther, we are introduced to the villain Haman, a man elevated by the king above his other princes and royal officials. We are reminded that Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag. 4 centuries earlier, God had commanded Saul to kill Agag, but he disobeyed and let Agag live. The prophet Samuel later carried out God's command and hacked Agag to death. Haman harbored intense hatred toward the Israelites because of this history, so he went to the king and proposed that all Jews living in the Persian Empire be killed. Because he trusted his chief courtier and mistakenly thought he was quelling a revolt before it had begun, Ahasuerus authorized genocide. Not long after, Mordecai informed Esther of what Haman had done and urged her to plead with the king for the lives of the Jews. Mordecai's plan for Esther's plea sounded simple enough, but in Persia, no one, including the queen, could appear before the king without his express invitation. The queen was understandably afraid of her potentially violent and irrational husband, but Mordecai urged her to be courageous. If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. But who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4 verse 13 to 14. Esther accepted the role assigned to her by God and approached the throne with anticipation, wondering how the king would react. The seconds felt like hours as she waited for Ahasuerus to acknowledge her presence. Then it happened. He looked at her and held out his royal scepter to welcome her beauty into his presence. Esther's willingness to put her position at the service of God's people set off a series of events that finally exposed Haman's evil plan. In the end, Ahasuerus rescinded the order to exterminate the Jewish people from the kingdom and had Haman sent to the gallows. Later, the king elevated Mordecai to deputy commander-in-chief of the entire empire. The real hero in this story is never mentioned, not even called by name, but God himself is the only explanation for the survival of the Jews in the midst of such hatred and resistance. His hand of providence is seen in every major event and every small detail as he protects and preserves his people. God's sovereign plan will prevail. It cannot be stopped. But like Esther before us, we must choose to act as willing instruments in his hands for the good of the world. Wherever you live, you are there for such a time as this.